So, here we are in second to last lesson actually of Jude, so the penultimate lesson. Today we're looking at verses 14 to 19, okay, of Jude, 14 to 19. So, there's two warnings that are given. He gives an ancient warning and a contemporary warning, and we'll get into what that is specifically. But let's read the passage and go from there. So, Jude, verses 14 to 19. But Enoch, in the seventh generation from Adam, also prophesied about these men, saying, quote, "Behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones, to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds, which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are grumblers, finding fault, following after their own lusts, and their mouths speak arrogantly, flattering people for the sake of their own benefit. But you, beloved, must remember the words that were spoken beforehand by the apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ, that they were saying to you, quote, in the last time there will be mockers, following after their own ungodly lusts. These are the ones who cause divisions, worldly minded, not having the Spirit." Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Alrighty. So, I mentioned that he's giving two warnings on the back end, or the tail end of the two different triumvirates of examples, so to speak, that we've had, mainly in verses 5 to 7, with another little interlude in verses 8 through 10, and then, of course, 11 to 13, which we looked at in the last lesson, right? Here, on the back end of those examples, of which there's basically 9 now, 9 examples from various points throughout history, he then gives two warnings, okay? One is, neither of which are from Jude specifically himself, right? Although he, by extension, as an apostle, you can kind of loosely rope him in. But one is an ancient warning, ancient even by his day, and one is a contemporary warning of his day, okay, specifically from Christ through the apostles, right? Of which he is one. Pretty neatly divided. So the ancient warning is verses 14 to 16, and then the latter half, or the second one, is verses 17 to 19. So that's basically how we're going to break it down today, right? Not terribly complex in terms of content. It's fairly straightforward. But as long as we understand that framework, it'll help us be able to understand what's going on. So verse 14. But Enoch, in the seventh generation from Adam, also prophesied about these men. Okay, so we've already covered before, back in verse 6 particularly, the reference to, sorry, not verse 6, pardon me, where is it? Going back a bit further. Actually, no, it is verse 6, no, I was correct. Verse 6, the angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, right? He is kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. He's already generally alluding to multiple chapters, really, through the book of First Enoch, which is part of the deuterocanonical books, or the apocryphal books, that we've mentioned in Q&A yesterday. But here, he's going to directly quote from the first chapter of First Enoch, okay? So Enoch, this is righteous Enoch, because there's two Enochs early on in there in Genesis, one descended from Cain, one descended from Seth, right? This is referring to the Sethite Cain, okay? So the Sethite Enoch, I should say, pardon me. And it doesn't really have any implication at all. It just is a small bit of clarification. Enoch, technically speaking, is the that big grandson, so 1, 2, 3, great grandson of Adam, which would technically make him what we today would call 6 generations afterwards, right? But in the ancient world, they often counted the progenitor as part of the generation. So if Adam is the first, he is the seventh. That's all that means, right? Because I've had that question once before for Adam being the first, yep, and then Enoch would be the seventh generation. We would count it as the sixth, but I've had that question one time by an overly inquisitive mind, and so I figured I might as well just jump the gun and over anticipate. But anyway, Enoch, the one descended from Adam through Seth, the son of Adam, also prophesied about these men, right? And so he's referencing first Enoch. Again, we've already discussed this in regards to the Deuterochronicles, or the apocryphal references here. The historicity of the works is inconsequential to the meaning of this text. Okay, he is referencing. If this is original and true, that's fine. If it's not, it's also fine. The point is about the actual point in the story. He's referencing things that the audience is familiar with, just like the Apostle Paul at times, well, multiple times, references a number of famous Greek philosophers, right, and poets. Okay. From antiquity. So referencing the opening chapter of First Enoch, he quotes here for verse 14 through the second half of 14 through the end of 15, right? Quote, "Behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones." He actually uses the word chiasma, which is 10,000, right? But anyway, a large number and a great multitude of his holy ones, to execute judgment upon all. The holy ones is a reference to the heavenly host or the heavenly army, the angels, okay? To execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of their ungodly deeds, which they have done in an ungodly way, and all these harsh things which the ungodly sinners have spoken against him. The very obvious repetition of ungodly 4 times here is kind of driving home the point. The purpose of this quotation is to describe the heretics who are in view, the Gnostics in purview here, who are being warned against, as these ungodly men. Does that make sense? They're being very clearly described as that, right? Rebellious false teachers seeking to corrupt what is good, who will have judgment executed upon them, is the essence of the point, right? Verse 16 on the back end of that, "These are grumblers, finding fault, following after their own lusts, and their mouths speak arrogantly, flattering people for the sake of their own benefit." Okay, not too dissimilar to the way that, again, these people have already been described in various different ways early on, especially through some of the examples. But even to remind you from verse 4, if you scan your eyes back up to verse 4. Verse 4, "For certain persons have crept in unnoticed, those who were long beforehand marked out for this condemnation." So marked out for condemnation, for the judgment, right? That's what's even being alluded to from that reference in 1 Enoch. Ungodly persons. So see how it should be obvious. He's already called them ungodly. And he's referencing a text that calls evil people in general ungodly, right? They're against God. They are... they do not walk in the ways of God. They do not walk in the ways of what is good, what is right, what is just, right? They serve darkness, not light, and turn the grace of God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. That's precisely what the words of this reference from 1 Enoch is exactly describing, right? The great judgment has and will befall all those who practice evil. Okay, that no matter what the wicked seem to get away with temporally here in this world, there is a judgment that awaits all men, and the heart of everyone will be weighed, and the judge of all the earth will do what is right. They're grumblers. They find fault. Right, so constantly pointing out the faults in others without actually, the implication of that is without actually having any introspection. So it's the kind of common phrase and adage that even the Lord references in the Gospels, of trying to take the speck out of a brother's eye whilst missing the log in your own, right? I might as well do it. I'll spend at least a minute or two talking about that concept. Sometimes that does, not always, but sometimes that does get misunderstood. The essence of that phrase, by the way, which ties into this whole concept of finding fault, of the speck versus log concept, right? Of trying to take a speck out of someone else's eye when you have a log. It's obviously hyperbolic, like it's meant to be ridiculous, right? That should not necessarily be understood, and that phrase was never understood historically when it was utilised, right? To mean, unless you are completely morally faultless, completely morally perfect, then never actually point out when someone's doing something wrong. That's not what it's mean, right? A speck and a log are made of the same substance. That's already giving you a clue as to what this means, right? If you have issues with controlling anger, definitely don't be the person to start calling out anger management issues in other people, right? You get the picture. Pick what you want. Doesn't really matter, right? You're not the person. Someone else is, but you're not that person, right? Because that's hypocrisy. Basically, the essence of that whole phrase, hyperbolic as it is hypocrisy, right? But if it's not something that's a problem for you, and if it's actually something that you have dealt with and that you are on the right path of, then absolutely you should you're free to criticize that in someone else. Now, your entire life should not be consumed with constantly finding faults in everyone else except for yourself, right? That's also a problem because that's what's being described here. So that's an issue of pride, right? Specifically through deflection, it's deflecting the light. It's deflecting the proverbial floodlight off of yourself onto someone else, right? Because God knows each and every one of us have our own sins to deal with, right? But the finding fault is not just about ever actually pointing out when someone else is doing something wrong, because we need that at times. It's a matter of a pattern of life, a pattern of how you actually operate, a pattern of even how you think. You're constantly, your gaze, the gaze of your radar, quote unquote, for detecting evil in the world is constantly focused outward and very little, if at all, focused inward, right? That's what the essence of grumbling or finding fault specifically is about, right?
There's no difference in size.
So, yeah.
The speck and the...
Yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the other part of it too. Yeah, exactly. Because it's meant to be hyperbolic. So it's like you're pointing out what is a comparatively small fault in someone else when this is something that's a big problem for you. But that's the type of person usually who will do that. Because if that person has a real big problem with XYZ thing, then they're going to want to try and deflect it off of them onto someone else. And if they can, it almost as like a coping mechanism, a self-soothing mechanism spiritually. Not good. But yeah, and so the actual issue size of the problem is very much a part of that, yeah, 100%. And so yeah, but the finding fault thing is not that you ever find fault at all, ever. It's about if that's your modus operandi, so to speak, right? That's what the finding fault part is, right? It's pride, ultimately, and hypocrisy. The grumbling one's a very interesting one, to be totally frank with you. Because we don't often think, generally speaking, of that being something that is... Well, we think of it as an issue. We usually don't think of it in any sinful kind of way, to be totally frank. At least in my experience. Maybe some do, and that's fine. But grumbling is one of the cardinal sins of the Exodus generation in the wilderness. In fact, it's one of the things they're primarily condemned for. Do you know what I mean? Right? We know that from Deuteronomy, obviously. Constantly complaining, at least relatively speaking, right? As a ratio. Constantly complaining. Okay? Constantly saying this isn't right, this is wrong, this should be better, we should be doing this, or no, we should be doing that. Grumbling, right? Or complaining, as you might say. It's the same thing, right? The reason why that is such a problem, the reason why God considers it to be sinful is primarily for two reasons. I suppose three, but really it's two. One is a lack of faith. If someone constantly is complaining about certain things, there's really only one of two options. Either there's a glaringly obvious problem that for some reason no one is trying to fix, or that can happen, or they just simply don't actually trust that God has something in control and that God is working out his will and his plan according to his own desire. Because if it's constantly a matter of there's something being wrong, it's more likely when we're talking about the way that human organizations work. It's more likely that you lack trust in the overall plan, not that there is a deep systemic issue. There can definitely be times where that's the case. I'm not discounting that. I'm talking on the balance of probabilities, 99 times out of 100, it's not that one exception. It's this thing, right? And so it's coming from a lack of trust, right? That's one side of it. The other side of it is, apart from lack of trust and it was lack of faith, can often be pride. Okay, which again should not be surprising because pride is the cardinal sin. It's the sin that begets all sin. It's the pride in, so it's either done out of a lack of trust or it's done out of arrogance, right, or pride. Arrogance coming from the pride, right, of thinking that you have the better idea or the better plan of how it should be going, right? And again, that only works if you're if you're right, okay. It's kind of like a lot when it's kind of like an argument when you double down on an argument. Doubling down on an argument only works if you're right. If you're wrong, it's literally the wrong. It's the worst move you can make. Okay, because it's called that at that point stubbornness, right? So, like with most things, if it's not accurate or right, if it's not in alignment with what is true, then it's going to be a train wreck, right? And so, in this case of pride, the person who constantly grumbles or complains, I'm using those terms interchangeably. The person who constantly grumbles is either doing so out of a lack of faith, i.e. a lack of trust in the operation of the plan, whatever it is, or they have convinced themselves that they know better and that they know better than those who God has put in positions of leadership. If we're talking about human organizations. In the case of the Exodus generation, it was constantly grumbling and thinking that somehow they knew better than Moses, right? Okay? Really, though, it was a lack of trust not so much in Moses as it was God. It kind of actually was with Moses, though, because obviously the rebellion of Korah was literally an attempt to overthrow Moses, right? That's the entire point of that, okay? So it was a direct revolution, right, that occurred, right? Which is why in 99% of times, revolution is, in general, especially if you think about it in historical terms like politics, is sinful. There's an extremely narrow set of circumstances where they would ever even be remotely justified, and usually it's to overturn some previous revolution and to restore things. It's not so much a revolution anyway. But getting back to the point, the issue of pride and lack of faith, kind of two sides of the same coin, right? That's what the nature of grumbling is. So constantly complaining is very consistently viewed as sinful by God, right? And that goes in all kinds of contexts. It goes in the context of the church. It goes in the context of family, right, marriage and stuff, all these kinds of things. So there's a balance. Like, you don't want to. We're not going to pretend that grumbling is like murder, but at the same time, we if anything, actually what would be the term? Not undervalue necessarily. We watered down grumbling or complaining as an issue, right? Because grumbling or complaining is not that you, again, just like with the finding fault thing, it's important to understand context. It's the problem with finding fault is not that you ever find fault ever, it's that you constantly are finding fault, right? That's what grumbling is. A legitimate complaint about something legitimate, it does not constitute a complainer or a grumbler, right? It's someone who's constantly, it's the old boy who cried wolf fable, right? Constantly complaining, constantly grumbling, constantly just nipping at the heels of the leaders of whatever it is, blah blah blah, is this very sin, right? And that's why it's listed here. There's being listed along, again, keeping in mind that he lists grumblers as the first choice in this list of the ungodly, of examples that he could be picking up on. Grumblers, finding fault, right? And following after their own lusts, and mouths speaking arrogantly, flattering people for the sake of their own benefit. He rolls grumblers finding fault out before he does lusts and speaking arrogantly, which at least should give weight to its significance, at least in that list, right? And yeah, mouth speaking arrogantly, flattering people for the sake of their own benefit is kind of fairly straightforward, right? Serpentine tongues, right? Smooth talkers. They speak arrogantly, flattering people, right? So they're sycophants, right? Sycophancy, in other words, exactly what this is describing, right? You flatter and suck up to people, not out of genuine compliment, but it's in order to move pieces around your chessboard of your plan. It's to manipulate. It's to direct people and events in your favor, right? That's what's, especially for ungodly, for ungodly benefit. This is the whole point, for their own benefit, for ungodly benefit. That's what's being spoken of, right? So that's the example it gives. That's the first one. It's the ancient warning, right? It's an ancient warning being given in the story, okay? The second one then is the latter half of our time today, which is verses 17 to 19, right? Which is a contemporary warning, okay, coming from Christ himself through the apostles, okay? So verse 17, but you, beloved, must remember the words that were spoken beforehand by the apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ, that they were saying to you, quote, in the last time there will be mockers following after their own ungodly lusts. These are the ones who cause divisions, worldly minded, not having a spirit. So you can already see a natural kind of confluence between the warning, the ancient warning and the contemporary warning, right? Two quotations coming from two different particular sources, right? In the last times, otherwise called the last days or the end of the age. There's various different ways that it gets phrased in Greek. But it's referring to the end of the way of the former age, the old covenant, right? That's certainly the way that the Apostle Peter uses it in Acts 2. In the last time, before this great judgment that will befall Jerusalem, there will be mockers, right? So scoffers, sometimes called in English, right? Obviously, you can see the mockers very clearly at the crucifixion. You can see the mockers all throughout his ministry, particularly among the Pharisees and the Sadducees and others, right? But it's not exclusively them, it's ultimately all the people end up becoming mockers, right? Following after their own ungodly lust. Again, there's that word ungodly again, okay? Who they are, what they do, is antithetical to God's nature and God's ways. That is what the essence of being ungodly is, okay? Which is deeply ironic, of course, because keep in mind that the entire essence of this, to refresh the memory from the words of verse 4, is those certain persons who have crept in unnoticed, right? So these are not exterior threats to the church, they're internal threats to the church, right? These are heretics within, not infidels without, okay? And then again, gives a listing here of these kinds of things that they do, just as he did with verse 16, right? So verse 16, these are grumblers, finding fault, blah, blah, blah. Here, these are the ones who cause divisions, worldly minded, not having the Spirit. They're divisive. And again, we're in the exact same position where understanding the way these terms get used in this context as well as in general helps us understand. Just like with finding fault does not mean that you never ever find a fault ever, or that you never lodge a legitimate complaint about a legitimate problem with a case of grumbling. Division is along those same lines, right? So the truth naturally divides. Okay, it divides between itself and its antithesis, namely error. Okay. So if someone believes that 2 + 2 = 4, another person believes that 2 + 2 = 5, there's not going to be much commonality or unity that can naturally exist, okay? Because you have one person in conformity with reality and another person who is not, right? And that's important to understand with that nature of truth. We've discussed that a lot, especially back in our study in Galatians, the previous Bible study in Galatians. But the way that we understand truth is not just merely as a set of propositions. That is the case, right? So if I say that the grass is green, that is in a sense a proposition, right? However, the nature of that proposition and what actually delineates it or determines it as true is by virtue philosophically of its conformity to what is real, okay? What is reality? And of course that's a deep and profound question that philosophers have been wrestling with for aeons. But the nature of that from a Christian perspective is that reality is that natural order, what we call the lex naturalis, the natural law. In other words, how has God designed the world? Right? Based on the execution of his own will. Okay, so how has God actually created and constituted the world? What is it by nature, and how does it function? Okay. Anything that is out of alignment with that, in other words, rejects that in one form or another, to one degree or another, doesn't really matter, is contrary to that reality, okay, to what is real, in other words, what is true, right? There is technically a semantic difference between the words, or a slight difference between the words real and true, but for the sake of this simple exercise, I'm using them synonymously. Ergo, therefore, when we think of it along these lines of division, the reason why truth is divisive is because ultimately, as we are becoming well acquainted with, as many have before us in history, when a people consistently operate, again, to one varying degree or another, against that order, i.e. that reality, i.e. that truth, they will continue to drift further and further and further away from it. Okay? From order to chaos. Okay? And the greater they become consumed with that, especially when you multiply this more than just well beyond the individual level, out to the level of entire nations of people, entire civilizations, when you scale it up to that degree, you end up with a scenario where things become entirely dysfunctional. In other words, they cannot function any longer. Okay? They can linger on some sense of historic inertia kind of flowing to them from the past, but they cannot, but eventually that will run out like a well, and once that well is run out, you are, to use another phrase, we're not even running on fumes anymore, you're running on empty, right? That's what occurs. And so there is a genuine sense, before we come around to the more specific meaning of what he means by divisiveness or divisions here, where there is a natural and necessary division that exists between truth and error, between order and chaos. Okay? That, however, is not what he is necessarily referring to here. What he's referring to is actually the opposite direction of the same paradigm. Okay? He's referring to those who are in error, who sow division among those who are abiding by truth, by leading them away from that into what is being feigned as the real truth. Does that make sense? Okay? That's causing division. Okay? We could use all kinds, there's 1,000 different examples that could go along these lines. But let's just use some obvious ones historically. There is a natural division that exists between us as Christians and Hindus. Pick an example. One says there is one God. The other says there is hundreds of millions, if we start getting technical in the ancestry. One says and then everything else that comes forward from that. Okay, we will be here all day talking about the distinctions and differences that are polar opposites, right? There's a natural division that lies there and must lie there, okay, because they're completely mutually exclusive, they can't work together. The kind of divisions that he's talking about is someone coming into the church and saying, yes, there is a God, there's one God, here's the apostles, here's the scriptures, here's how the church works. But actually, here's the real or the true nature of Jesus Christ, and it's something different than what Christ and the apostles actually taught. That would be an example like Arianism. Okay, so the Arian heresy is a classic example of this, right? Of someone internally causing division where there does not or should not actually exist division naturally, because everyone should be on the same page on that subject. But from within, not without, from within, drives division between the people of God through false teachings, right? Through novel innovations in concepts, right? These are the ones causing. These are the ones who cause division. worldly minded, right? Not having the Spirit being the final kind of component of that, right? They're not actually from God, okay? All those who speak and act in accordance with truth will do so based upon what the God of truth has already ordered and created and said, okay? Things that are contrary to God are by nature contrary to truth, for obvious reasons, okay? He is truth, right? So theoretically, and we're getting a bit heady here philosophically, but it gets the point across. Theoretically, God could have, to a degree, that, and it is only to a degree, done a variety of different things of different kinds of operations in the world. Okay, theoretically, theoretically, the polar bear could be the size of a cat, and our house cat could be the size of the polar bear. Okay, theoretically, right? It'd make it a lot safer in the Arctic and a lot more annoying at home, and inconvenient. Theoretically, there's all kinds of variables which, in the theoretical sense or the theoretical realm, could be different. That has its limitations, though, right? Because the natural world is created in accordance with the divine nature, which is concrete and absolute. So there's only a limitation in that, right? So the nature of love would not. There's no theoretical sense in which the nature of love would be different. Okay. There's no theoretical nature in which murder would somehow in a different world be virtuous or correct. Okay, because it would completely change the concept or the nature of who God is by nature. So that's what I say it's within limitations, right? But other variables, there's all kinds of things that invariance would be different. The reason why I point that out, though, is that, again, I know it's in this theoretical kind of concept, is that when it comes to truth, and this is why I'm making this point, because truth itself is defined by who God is, okay, so there is no scenario, even theoretically, in which murder would be righteous or not evil, however you want to think of it, right? Because God is the source and fountain of life ontologically, in other words, by nature, everything that has existence has its initial beginning of existence and its sustained existence in, through, and by his nature or his power. There is no world, theoretically or otherwise, in which the destruction of life or the unjustified taking of life, murder, would ever therefore be right. Okay, because it will completely violate his divine nature or his character. Okay, that's why he can say that divisiveness, or those who cause divisions, do not have the Spirit. Okay, if they're against God because of their stance against the truth, that's the link. Is that making sense? Yeah. And so that's why it's so important to understand this kind of concept in our time, because we're coming off the back end of a slow progressive march from the Enlightenment onward, in which truth and our relationship to truth and even our conceptualization of truth has shifted multiple degrees, right? We shifted from divine revelation being the source of knowledge, okay, to human reason being the ultimate arbiter, okay, because that is the fundamental sin of the Enlightenment. It's the detachment of divine revelation through the natural order and through sacred scripture, both together. It's the separation of divine revelation and human reason, okay? And by consequential result, elevating human reason onto a pedestal that it should not have been on, right? Once that decoupling took place, everything else flowed forward from that, right? And so human reason becomes the arbiter of reality and of truth, except 5 minutes in we realized that there are competing ideologies as to how you actually determine that. And you've heard me talk before, even just yesterday, about the rationalist and empiricist schools of the Enlightenment, okay? Those who believe we can only, the empiricists, various different kinds, like John Locke and others, who believe that we can know truth through our empirical senses, so it's external to internal, whereas the rationalists believe that, like Descartes and others, that we can know things internally and rationally, right? Cogito sum ergo est, right? I think, therefore I am. Okay, the famous Cartesian phrase. I think, therefore I am, therefore I exist. Because I can think, I have internal rational capabilities, therefore I know I exist. This is this internalized capability. And that works for a while, but it's ping-ponging back and forth between ideas, right? Because you've already abandoned the ultimate source. And so all you're now left with is human views or opinions about how this stuff supposedly works, right? That works for a while. We get what we call the modernist philosophy that lasts us through to the world wars. The world wars are then seen as a natural consequence of that view. And then in the second half or the latter half of the 20th century, particularly by the time you get to the 80s and the 90s, multiple world wars, various different proxy wars through the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, etc. And we enter what we call the postmodern phase, which is basically and essentially the belief that we can't actually know what's true. Truth is entirely subjective. There is no objective nature or reality to truth whatsoever. And so, of course, colloquial, popular level phrases like you have your truth and I have my truth, therefore develop. Okay? It gets even worse than that, but that's just basically the essence of it, right? And so Europe and European descended civilizations have been marching from one disastrous concept to another for hundreds of years because of this problem, because of the rejection of the metaphysical nature of truth. Okay, metaphysics, in other words, dealing with what is the nature of things, right? The ultimate nature of things, the metaphysical reality of truth. Pardon the kind of repetition. The reality of things, the reality of truth. The metaphysical reality of truth is that it is that which is in conformity with the divine nature and the divine will. Okay? Anything outside or beyond that is by nature a lie, as we would say, or not true, right? Which essentially is the same thing. Okay? So that's why he can say divisions and equate that with not having God, or being against God, in other words. Okay? Right? That's what he means by not having God, in other words, you're against God. Right? That concept alone is something that's fundamental to understanding how life should be, how we should live as human beings, how we should act and operate in the world around us, our own sense of what is even real, all these kinds of things. Okay, and this ties deeply as well, just to add the kind of cherry on the top, to the identification of Jesus Christ as the Logos from Greek philosophy. Okay. So to cut a very long story short, the essence of the Logos, which was something that was first articulated 300-400 plus years before Christ, in Ephesus actually, first off. The Logos, in other words the word, was, where we get the word logic from in English obviously, was conceived by the ancient Greek philosophers to be that which created, well, some would say created, some would only say maintained, but usually they say both. Created, and it's the creative and sustaining force of the universe, of the cosmos, to use that Greek term, cosmos, right, which means world, where we get the word cosmology from. The creative and sustaining power or force of the cosmos. Okay, so everything that exists and continues to exist comes from and through and continues to be by that Logos, okay, which is exactly why the Apostle Paul in Athens describes the Greeks as fumbling through the dark. They got closer than any of the ancient pagans did, right? They never quite got there, okay? So the fundamental issue with the Logos was the fact that, like most things, including Aristotle's prime mover, which again, through his own philosophical deductions, deduced, again, the tautology, that the world had to have had a beginning, right? He used an apple tree as an example in his works. Seed in the ground, it grows up into a tree, it eventually bears the fruit. Apples, eventually the apples fall down, they decompose, seeds get scattered in the winds, and then eventually X amount of those seeds take root, water, cycle, boom, new tree, right? That cycle, you just go back and infinitely repeat it, right, has to have a beginning. When did the first seed get planted, okay? So Aristotle and the ancient Greeks knew well that the world had a beginning, okay? All the pagans did. No one really outside of certain Eastern religions like Hinduism and others thought that the world was eternal in any meaningful sense. Who he called the unmoved mover, or the prime mover, prime meaning first, right? The first mover. That force which put everything else into motion, the uncaused cause, right? It must, and he referred to it, because again, the Greeks didn't have any concept of this being a he or a person, right? He must be eternal, so himself uncreated, otherwise he would just be one more proverbial apple tree in the line, right? He must be all-powerful to bring everything into existence, keeping in mind that the Greeks had a broad theoretical understanding of what an atom was, right? He must, all eternal, always existing, all-powerful. He must also be have some sense of. It must also have some sense of active, ongoing maintenance in operation of things to maintain order, right? All these kinds of concepts. It's aligning very much with what the Logos was conceptualized as well, right? It's not until we get to the famous prologue of John's Gospel that for the first time in history, the Logos is identified not as an it, but as a he. That there is a personage to it. That's the missing key that the Greeks did not figure, right? Could have and probably should have, to be totally honest with you, because the aspect of the nous, of the mind, ironically did not get picked up by any of the ancient Greeks who spent all time mulling around in their own mind about these things. But anyway, that's why that's the limitations of paganism. They got closer than anyone else without actually crossing the line. But all of that is to then say, and the reason why I'm bringing that up is because that is exactly who Christ is. He is the he that is the Logos that the ancient Greeks understood, right? He is Aristotle's prime mover. He is the one that caused all things to be. He is the one that continues to sustain the order of all that is, right? To be against him is to be against that order. It is to be against, and that order is what we call truth. That is what truth is, fundamentally, okay? 2 plus 2 equals 4, and this is why I'm going to round it up because it took more of a while, right? This is a really good example of how this works. I'm saying with my mouth, as I am expelling air out of my lungs through the force of my diaphragm and other musculature, manipulating it unconsciously and really unknowingly with the vocal cords and the tongue and the shape of my mouth, to say 2 plus 2 equals 2 in English, right? Or I can write it down on paper with our Arabic numerals, which we use also in English or in any other language that I want to choose from there on. Or I can say this many combined with this many equals this many. Various different representations, physical representations of what is really an abstract truth. Okay, that's why I can write it down, I can use sticks, I can say this many objects combined with this many objects equals this many objects. I can say it out loud, right? No matter what we articulate or define along those terms in languages and examples and physical representations of abstract things, all of that is defined as true because 2 plus 2 equals 2 in the way that God has designed the world. No matter what we're calling it, no matter what we're defining it as. So 2 plus 2 equals 4, pardon me, sorry. 2 plus 2 equals 4, pardon me, sorry. Yes, sorry. I'm going off and off. 2 plus 2 equals 4. I'm saying it so many times it's getting too stuck in my head, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4. Which would be a good example of pointing out when someone is out of alignment, even unknowingly, with the natural order. So when you say 2 so many times, you end up just going 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, and you get stuck in an infinite loop of saying 2, right? When 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? But without being smart, that little unorganized little thing that we just had there for the last 20 seconds is exactly the very point of what I'm trying to say, right? So even unintentionally, I might sit here and pretend I did it purposely, but I won't. The way in which, even unknowingly there, now I'm thinking back on retrospectively, I'm unconsciously realizing that I was saying 2 plus 2 equals 2 because I was saying 2 so often that I just got stuck in a loop of saying 2, right? Sure, right? And so see how even, now that this makes for the perfect example to finish this whole point off, that my realization as to whether or not I'm actually saying the accurate or the correct thing has no bearing on whether or not I am truly saying the correct or the accurate thing. So you all sitting there realizing that I just said 2 plus 2 equals 2 or whatever I said. I didn't realize I was saying 2 plus 2 equals 2, which is precisely what determines whether or not something is or is not true. So my own self-perception, so if you hadn't pulled that up, I wouldn't have realized that. I'm just going on autopilot as I'm already thinking like 2-3 sentences ahead of what I'm trying to say here, right? My own subjective view of what I was or was not saying there in that little example is not the ultimate arbiter as to whether or not what I was saying was truthful. My conformity to the natural order is what determines that. And that natural order is objective because the God who created it is that objective standard. Ta-da.